quick intro about Connor. He's a native Washingtonian. Grew up on the west side, so immediately graduated from high school. I had to go all the way over to Pullman. Got his bachelor's degree at Washington State in 2011, and then, pretty typical of students that wanted to go into natural resources, wildlife fisheries, ended up doing technician work for years and years. And that's just what it takes, right? That's the way it is. Alaska, and came back and worked for Pacific States Fisheries, and then Yakima Nation, and private consultant, Terra Aqua up in the Entiat, a lot of field work, and then for some reason decided maybe enough technician, get another degree, and become a real biologist. Maybe. We'll see. So he came here in 2015 to start his master's. And most of you don't know this, but I think a few of us that have been here a really long time, like myself and Dan back in Ernest. Ashton, where are you, Ashton? Ashton defended last fall, right? And now Connor. They're getting married this summer. This will make the fourth couple of fish students getting married. I don't understand that. And I certainly will take note of that. It just happens. Anyway. All right, Connor, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks, Paul. Thank you for coming. I know it's really pretty outside. I would have wanted to stay home. Today we're going to be talking about my thesis work, looking at salmonids in urban stream, their movement, potential barriers, and fragmented habitat. I'm going to be saying the word salmonid over and over again today, and what I'm referring to when I say salmonid is a variety of different species within the family Salmonidae. So local examples of these fish include our Pacific salmon species like Chinook and coho salmon, also steelhead, and then rainbow, brook, and also cutthroat trout. So it's really important to understand that within this family there's a variety of different life histories. Today I'm mainly just going to talk about the two kind of most well-known ones. And these are the anadromous and resident life histories. So this species right here is Oncorhynchus mykiss, and this is a native species to this area. And in its anadromous form, it is called a steelhead. So this means that they go out to the ocean for a certain period of life before returning back to freshwater to spawn. And then if it decides to be a resident fish and never go to the ocean, then we would refer to it as a rainbow trout. So even within a single species, it can exhibit multiple life histories. However, regardless of life history or what species you are, movement's really important. And so I just kind of want you to keep this in mind while I give my talk. So it's important for habitat connectivity. These salmonids need to access different habitat, not only seasonally, but also just during different stages of development, and also for gene flow, just remaining connected between more distant populations. So no matter what species you are, you all start out as an egg. Typically, for most salmonids, they're deposited in some well-oxygenated gravel. After that, they emerge from the gravel. They're super vulnerable. We call them an alvin or a fry. And if they're lucky enough to survive this life stage, they'll become a juvenile salmonid. And this is the point at which they kind of split off those two different life histories I was talking about. So if you're going to be a resident fish, you just remain in fresh water for your whole life, kind of like this rainbow trout here. If you're anadromous, then you go through this process called smoltification, and you become a smolt. You can see this fish is a lot more silver in color than this freshwater fish. So they do this, and they make a huge migration out towards the ocean, spend some time in the estuary where their body adjusts so they can function in a marine environment. Then they go out to the ocean for a few years, and then they once again return to freshwater to spawn. So this is where these life histories kind of converge again, and all salmonids, like I said, spawn in fresh water. Now, if you're Pacific salmon, such as those Chinook and coho again, you die immediately after spawning. If you're a resident species or even a steelhead in the anadromous form of Oncorhynchus mykiss, they will return and try and do this whole cycle over again. So historically, salmonids were really abundant within the Columbia Basin. Every year, millions of fish used to return to this area, and because of that, they were a really reliable food source for Native American people. Then when European Americans arrived and settled the Pacific Northwest, they became really good at also taking advantage of this food source. You know, some of these fish weighing around 100 pounds. So they're really an important food source for humans. Besides just being important for humans, they're also critically important as a keystone species. So when they're in the freshwater system, when they're really small, these juveniles are fed on by a variety of different predators. They make this massive migration out towards the ocean. Some, like bird species, even time their migration so that they can feed on them at certain times of year when these fish are heading out. And then when they're in the ocean, they're fed on by a bunch of other predators before they return and have to run a whole other gauntlet up to their headwater streams to spawn. They typically spawn in these freshwater ecosystems, which really are nutrient poor, and because of that, they're really important. Especially these Pacific salmon species, such as this coho here, they spawn and die immediately afterwards, and then as their bodies decompose, their nutrients are deposited in the aquatic system and are also a big part of the terrestrial system as well, and drive a lot of the ecosystem functions in these areas. So despite their importance, these salmonids have been in decline over the last few centuries, and I'm going to touch on a few examples of why. First one here, kind of obvious, overfishing. You can see how that would impact salmonid populations. Then issues associated with their hydrologic networks. So dams can potentially completely block the upstream migration of fish, or they can just alter the aquatic environment to something that salmonids are not well adapted for. Then these last four are all land use related. I'm sure many of you are familiar with agriculture being in Taft County. And that takes water away from streams during really important warm months, which is a negative thing for salmonids that require really cold water. That water is then returned to the streams with a lot of sediments in it, which once again is another negative thing for salmonids. Then really poor grazing activities in and around riparian areas can really devastate streams. And then these last two pictures are historic images from the upper Yakima Basin. This is a mining operation on the Swat Creek. You can see how that would really destroy stream habitat. And then this is a big log drive on the Tianaway River. So you just can imagine, these old growth timber being pushed down these streams and just scouring out the stream bed and crushing salmonids and their habitat. So because of the importance of salmonids and the reason, and because they haven't been doing that well, there's been a lot of efforts to help recover them. So there's been federal, state, tribal, and nonprofit entities that have worked together to help recover these species, and I have a few of them shown here. Some of them have focused on, regulating and restricting fishing season. Other ones have been more focused on managing, land use practices and making sure people aren't degrading the habitat. Others, like the EPA, are used to care about water. And then, other people have focused, on trying to, enhance and recover some of the habitat in these areas. So I'm going to touch on a few of the real main ones that have helped to recover salmonid species. Hatcheries are really common. They're kind of controversial. They can have their drawbacks. But locally, for example, the coho were extirpated from our area, and the Yakima Nation has used hatcheries in some of their breeding programs to bring that extirpated species back into the valley. Also, habitat restoration has become really big over the last 50 years. You can see that planting native plants can help stabilize soils, reduce erosion issues, and also can provide habitat for fish. Furthermore, installing these large woody debris structures can create habitat for juvenile salmonids to hang out and hide from predators. And also this creates stream complexity, which scours out the stream bed and creates different habitat types. So adult coho, for example, could use the tail out of this pool for spawning purposes. Another really obvious large-scale improvement is removing some of our dams. This is the Condit Dam on the White Salmon River, which enters into the Columbia kind of down by Hood River. And you can see removing that structure not only allows access to all these kayakers, but also allows salmonids to return back to systems where they've been removed for around a century. And then on the smaller scale, culverts are something that are really commonly installed throughout our area. And if they're installed incorrectly, they can create a situation where salmonids can't access upstream habitat. And so this can kind of limit the carrying capacity of a small stream. And maybe one culvert doesn't seem to cause that big of a problem, but cumulatively we have culverts, all of thousands of them all over our national forests. And so the combined effect can be pretty big. So because of a lot of the restoration and recovery efforts in the Yakima River, species like summer, spring chinook, fall chinook, coho, steelhead, and even sockeye that I don't have pictured here, overall their populations are kind of trending in the positive direction. However, these runs remain like a shadow of their former selves, so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to help recover these species. So when I arrived at Central Washington University, as Paul said, I've been working with Salmonids for a while, and so I was interested in continuing to do so. And locally, there's a variety of species that are of concern for recovery purposes. These include, steelhead, spring chinook, coho, and also sockeye. So I want to see if maybe there was an aspect that hadn't been studied as much, so that maybe a project that I could design could help benefit the recovery of some of these species to our area. So one idea that's been talked about a lot is potentially returning some of these salmonid species to our urban streams, where some of them used to historically spawn and rear. Before I get into my study design, I think it's really important to understand the difference between what goes on in an urban system and what a natural system might be like. So urban systems are characterized by an abundance of impervious surfaces, due to things like rooftops, roadways, and even like really highly compacted soils or gravel. And because they're so compacted or impermeable, water flows over them during rain events or during runoff, and it goes right into these streams, which can result in an increase in flood events, similar to what we've been seeing here the last few weeks. Also, because of our human activities in these areas, there's a lot of issues related to increased nitrogen, phosphorus, and then also some toxicants in these areas, or toxins in these areas. Our cars some of them are leaking oil or gas, they got stuff coming off our brake pads, and that all gets washed in the stream. On top of that, especially in a place like Kittitas County, where we have a lot of agriculture going on, we have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus that goes into these systems, which isn't natural. When we develop these lands, we typically degrade the riparian area. That's that highly vegetated zone on each side of the stream. And in doing so, we remove a lot of fish cover elements, such as undercut banks, larger debris, overhanging vegetation. And this has a variety of negative effects. Also, when you degrade these riparian areas, that allows sun to infiltrate these systems. And because salmonids have adapted to thrive in really cold water environments, this can be an issue during summer months, because the stream temperature can really ramp up, and that can have negative effects on their growth and survival. Also, in these urbanized systems, we like to channelize them to kind of maximize the space in which we can build land. And in doing so, we make these really homogeneous, not really high quality fish habitat, and we remove a lot of the natural sinuosity or meandering that you see in streams, which is really important because, as you can see, it creates different habitat and different spaces in the river. And the final one I'll talk about today are buried sections of stream. So in places where we want to cross a river or a stream, we install these culverts and force a stream underground through them. And this has a variety of negative effects, including, first off, it just fragments habitat. There's open stream, buried stream, open stream again. That's not something that naturally happens out there in nature. And then also, depending on the diameter of the culvert, the length of the culvert, and the slope at which it is installed, it can create a scenario where the water velocity can become so extreme that fish won't be able to move upstream through it, at least seasonally or sometimes at all points. So despite all of these issues that I talked about, degraded, fragmented habitat, many potential movement barriers in urban streams, it's been mentioned that we might want to try and cover some species in here to benefit the whole, some of these species in the Upper Yakima Basin. And the two species that are the most likely candidates are coho salmon and steelhead trout. These are both anadromous species, and historically they spawned and reared in these systems. And I have found some historical information saying that Native Americans used to collect them in some of these small urban streams in and around Ellensburg. However, there's really limited data on this topic. I had a really hard time finding any information on the movement of salmonids in an urban stream, so I wanted to explore this further before we go and invest a lot of resources into the recovery of these fish in these areas. So the one study that I could find was done by Dr. James here, my primary advisor. Him and some other students tracked the movement of some juvenile Yakima Nation coho, which were planted in Mercer and also Wilson Creek. And they were able to successfully document the downstream movement of these fish, including roughly 6% of them that were encountered on downstream Columbia River main stem dams. So that was really encouraging, because if we want to get fish back in these systems, we hope that they can rear in them and then also successfully navigate through these potential barriers and head on out towards the ocean. However, they still have some questions. They didn't really see much upstream movement, and so they also wanted to see, that led them to believe that maybe a lot of these buried sections of stream might be potential movement barriers. They also didn't collect any information on growth data. How were these fish growing, even though 6% of them made it out? Were they healthy? Also, what kind of habitat were they using? Because as I mentioned, these urban systems are really degraded and are really more homogeneous. So that's where my study comes in. So my objectives on the movement side of things was to study the movement of salmonids in an urban stream. I really want to focus on the range, some of the directionality up and downstream, observe some of their seasonal activity, see how they navigate those potential movement barriers, and also see how different age classes handle this urban stream environment. For habitat purposes, I want to characterize my urban stream study area. I wanted to evaluate a small restoration project that was on the lower section of my study area, which I will talk about in a lot more detail. And also I want to compare habitat that was used by salmonids to what was actually available to them. So luckily for me, when designing the study, there's a really great example of an urban stream right here in town, and I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with this area. This is the Wellness Center up here. This is the CERT parking lot. And so Wilson Creek flows through that parking lot, underneath the University Way, and then pops up kind of down by Vindman's Bakery. So my study area is roughly 710 meters in length, and within that area there's 5 buried sections of stream. Buried sections 2 through 5 are more typical of what you would see in our area on our low gradient urban streams. However, buried section 1 is more of an anomaly for this area. It's roughly 300 meters in length. It's been buried for over a century, and we aren't even really sure on the exact route in which it takes underneath some of these streets and buildings. Between those buried sections are open sections of stream, and they range in not only their size, but also the quality of habitat that they offer the aquatic community. And I want to draw your attention to open section 1 down here. So that's the restored area that I was mentioning a lot, and it was restored in 2009 to benefit the aquatic community, and also to create a small park, which I'm sure some of you have been to. So to monitor the movement of these fish, I then had to break down my open section of the stream into smaller segments to provide me a scale. And so I broke them into 10-meter segments, and so this is the scale at which I monitored their movement during my study. To monitor their movement, of course, I had to first get my hands on them. So I went out with a crew of volunteers using a Smith Root backpack electrofisher. For those of you that don't know, electrofisher just sends an electric current into the stream, stuns the fish. Hopefully you have some good netters and they catch the fish. And we would put all species that we found for each 10-meter segment of stream in its own unique bucket, so we keep track of them. Once we collected those fish, we then identified them all as species, and we assigned them to that 10-meter segment of origin that I mentioned. For salmonids, we measured all of them, and anything greater than 70 millimeters in length, we went ahead and pit tagged, and I'll get into pit tags here in a second. Once those fish were allowed to recover, we could tell that they could swim properly. We returned them back to the same 10 meters of stream in which we originally found them. So pit tag stands for passive integrated transponder, and they're really commonly used in the study of salmonids. They're very useful because they're really small, they're only 12 millimeters in length, they're not this big, and they have a unique alphanumeric code which allows you to track the movement of individuals. And because they're so small, you can implant them in the body cavity of salmonids and not impact their swimming capabilities. They don't have a power source, that's one of the reasons they're so small, so they aren't constantly emitting a signal like maybe a radio transmitter would, for example. So you have to use different techniques to actually go in and track these fish. So what I did is, first of all, to study the movement of fish within my study area, I used this handheld reader, which is right here. I'll show it to you in a little bit. And then I also constructed these pass-through permanent antennas with the help of Zach Mays from the Yakima Nation. And I installed them at the top and bottom of my study area, and this allowed me to monitor the movement of any fish that exited or then returned to my study area. So what salmonids were out there when we did our electrofishing? There was 12 Oncorhynchus mykiss, so once again these are those native, either rainbow or potentially steelhead if they end up going out to the ocean. And then the majority of them were actually an invasive species called the eastern brook trout, which is native to the eastern United States. And while most people might think that this is a really bad thing for my study, because why do you want to study invasive species, I would prefer that there was native species there, but the brook trout made a really convenient study analog for what I was interested in. They're really closely related to our native salmonids. They're similar size to what we would expect for juvenile salmonids if we could get them back in the system. They occupy a similar niche, they have similar swimming capabilities, and they also have really similar habitat requirements. For example, brook trout and coho have almost identical optimum temperature ranges and growth cutoffs. And Oncorhynchus mykiss, their temperature tolerances are even slightly elevated above that. So a lot of the information you can get from monitoring the movement and habitat use of brook trout, we could then kind of apply to a lot of our native species that we'd like to get back in these areas. So I was able to collect 104 fish, and the majority of them being brook trout with just, once again, 12 Oncorhynchus mykiss. And then within my study area, I had 5 open sections, and the majority of the fish that we collected and tagged were in that open section 1, which was again that restored area. I originally only wanted to go in and do one fish capture event because I wanted to track the movement with this handheld reader because it's less intrusive, I feel. I don't think that fish really enjoy being electrocuted over and over and over again during the study, so I was trying to not do that. But when we went in June to collect these fish, the young year age class was young year stands for juvenile salmonids within the first year of development. So these are really small fish that are of interest to me because they have decreased swimming capabilities and sometimes occupy different habitat. And so I never expected them to be anywhere near the size that I could actually tag them, but they were pretty close to my 70mm cutoff in June. So we decided to give them 2 months to grow, and then we went back in 2 months later to collect and tag those young year because I was interested in what they were doing in the urban stream environment. So this smaller cluster data here, these are my young year lengths at time of tagging, and then this larger group here are adults and juveniles. I lumped all adult and juveniles together because at this time of year during the spring I can't really tell which ones are going to spawn or not, and there isn't like an exact size in which they are reproductively mature, so I just lumped them together. And young year, there was 21 of those brook trout that I was able to monitor. So to track these fish, I used this handheld reader, and so it's a pretty useful tool. This one's kind of old now. But it looks like a metal detector. When people saw me out in Wilson Creek in the middle of the night looking for fish, they thought I was using a metal detector and wondered what I was up to. And so it's a really useful tool, but it does have its drawbacks. So it has a read range of like 3 to 5 inches, which isn't very much because these fish, are easily disturbed and they'll swim away from you. So I had to move really slowly when I used it. So what I would do is I would submerge it underwater and I kind of sweep it really slowly side to side as I walked upstream. And then if I ran into a fish that I had tagged, that tag code would get read by the antenna and it would be read out on this really old reader here. And I would then associate that unique pit tag code with the 10-meter stream in which I found that fish. So it was a pretty effective way of tracking these fish actually, and it came in really handy in like areas where there's a bunch of cut banks or something like that because it can read through the soil, so I can kind of like slide it over the top of cut banks and read them. And then also in the winter, it was really cold in January and December, so my stream almost froze all the way across, so I could kind of slide it across some of these ice shelves and it would still read the tags underneath it. So it actually ended up being pretty useful. So I did surveys every single week from June all the way through January, and I alternated between doing day and night surveys so I could catch some of that different times where these fish might be active. And then I went back in one final time on January 23rd to get my hands back on those fish so I could get some growth data on the young year age class and also a final location on some of those salmonids. So getting into some of my results, I'll start off with habitat. So this graph shows the average daily stream temperature within my study area, and then these 2 horizontal lines represent the growth cutoff that I talked about previously. For Oncorhynchus mykiss is this black one, and then brook trout and potentially coho salmon that we'd like to get back in the system. And what you can see is that the average daily stream temperature never exceeded either one of these temperature thresholds, so the conditions are pretty optimal for the growth of a lot of these species. So that was pretty obvious in the young year age class. When I first went out there and collected them in June, they were roughly 63mm in length on average. And for those of you that aren't fish people, this is really big. And then by the end of my study, they'd almost doubled in size to on average 126mm. Like I said, I never expected them to be this big, but we had a really early spring in 2016, so I think they started growing a lot earlier than they typically would. So I wanted to see how this would compare to what's been observed in some other studies. So I found a book that summarized the end of year 1 growth for young year brook trout in a bunch of different systems throughout North America. And they range in size from 46mm to 112mm. And to contrast that, in my study, they range from 103 to 155mm. So these fish were growing really rapidly. So if we were able to get juvenile salmonids back in the system, they could probably benefit from those similar growth conditions. So I also went through and, for habitat purposes, and delineated all of my channel units. It's similar to what you see in this image. I didn't actually draw dotted lines. But yeah, so I followed the Columbia Habitat Monitoring Program protocol, which is a protocol that I've been using for the past few years at work. And so I went through and documented all the habitat that was available to these fish. There was pool, riffle, and non-turbulent habitat. So riffle habitat, these are shallow water, higher gradient, faster water sections. Non-turbs are kind of shaped more like an irrigation ditch, and the water's a little bit slower, but it's still moving a bit faster and there's less structure to it. And then pools are those characteristic channel units that I'm sure any of you can pick out that have that concavity and are really deep. And they've been shown to be really important for salmonids. So I wanted to see what habitat was there and what habitat the fish were actually using. Because as I mentioned, these systems have been really, homogenized, and they don't really like that. Typically, salmonids prefer this kind of habitat where there's a 1-to-1 pool to riffle ratio. So I went through and surveyed it, and I then made these graphs. So these light gray bars represent the number of individual salmonids I would have expected to find in each channel unit if they were evenly distributed throughout my study area and weren't selecting for any habitat type. So half of my study area was riffle habitat, and half of my fish would have been found in there. Similarly, quarter for each one of these ones. However, these dark gray or black bars here represent where I actually found these fish or what they were associated with. So how I got this data is I went through and for each 10-meter segment of stream, I documented the dominant habitat type that was present. And so that's how I came up with the gray ones. That's what was available in my study. And then when I actually captured a fish, I then associated it with that 10-meter segment and the dominant habitat type within that segment. So as you can see, adults and juveniles were found more often in pool and non-turb habitat than what you would have expected. And young year were kind of more found in non-turbulent units. So I ran a chi-square goodness of fit test for both adult and juvenile age classes. And so this test just compares the proportions of habitat to use versus what was available. And it shows that there was a significant relationship for adults and juveniles, that they were using this habitat in a different proportion than what was available to them. I ran the same test for young year, and what was really close, it did not return a significant result. So I also collected a variety of different habitat variables or metrics. I didn't want to bore you with going through each one of these graphs, but they are at the end, so if you really want to see them, I will show them to you. So for today's purposes, I just kind of organized them and ranked them 1 through 5, with 5 being the highest quality rating for each one of these metrics. So I looked at large weed debris, which are large branches and logs that are really important for fish. Fish cover, this is using that CHAMP protocol again, and you document all fish cover elements that are within 1 meter above the stream surface that could function as fish cover. Canopy cover, just the amount of sunlight that's being allowed into the system. Sinuosity is a ratio that kind of measures how much a stream meanders between 2 points. And then section length, longer stretches of habitat would be more useful than a bunch of fragmented sections. And then percentage of pools, like I said, pools are really important to salmonids. So on average, section 1 had the highest rating. You can see it pictured here. And visually, you can just see that's higher quality habitat in this. And once again, section 1 is that restored area that I mentioned. And section 2, you can see, received a pretty low score, and it's pretty urbanized. So I wanted to see then if that habitat might be impacting the aquatic community. So I mentioned when we did those electrofishing surveys, we collected all fish species that were present. In section 1, we were able to capture 7 different species of fish, and 6 of those actually were native, which I was kind of surprised. What we found was Oncorhynchus mykiss, and then also this is speckled dace, sculpin, brook lamprey, bridge lip sucker, and red-sided shiner. So it was really encouraging to see all these native species using that restored habitat. As I moved upstream, I never saw more than 4 species present, and I never saw more than 3 native species present. So it appears that they're enjoying this restored habitat. Even though this graph is really obvious that diversity is going to be highest in section 1, I calculated a Shannon diversity index, and it basically confirmed what this graph is showing you, that diversity was highest in section 1. I also looked at salmonid densities per meter, and density was highest in section 1 and also in section 4. So getting into my movement results, my recapture went really well, much better than I ever expected. Out of the 400, I wish I had 400 fish, 104 fish that we put out pit tags in, I was able to recover 98% of them. 12 of them eventually were documented as either being sheds or mortalities. 6 of those, however, I tracked multiple times during my study, and then all of a sudden there was just 6 shed or dead tags that I found in October. And so at first I was like, what the heck's going on? Why are my fish dying? But I talked to local biologists and also looked online, and I found that There is some evidence that sometimes female salmonids, when they spawn, they will expel their pit tag during spawning. So I think a lot of this was associated with that activity because all these fish that lost their tag were really large, mature brook trout. Using my handheld reader, I was able to observe fish 583 times, so that was pretty good. And then my stationary antennas, I had over 11,000 observations. So I had a lot of data to work with. I was interested to see if my day capture events were more successful than my night capture events, so I ran a t-test, and it returned a significant result showing that night recapture events were significantly more successful than my day capture events, which I kind of guessed would be the case. This graph is getting at some of that seasonal activity I mentioned I was interested in. So my top and bottom of site antennas every month received thousands of hits on them. A lot of the time it was just two fish, so we just go back and forth over and over again and get red a bunch of times. So each month I would go through, sort all those tags, and remove all the duplicates. And so these light gray bars are the unique tags that were encountered on these antennas each month. And so what you can see is in October, there was double the number of encounters than there was at any other time during my study. This also coincided with this increase in stream flow that is graphed here with the black line. In October, we had a bunch of rain events, and so the water level really ramped up. And then also, at the beginning of October, I started observing spawning activity for those brook trout. So there's kind of a biological reason behind this increased activity that I saw during the study. This graph is basically just looking at the correlation between salmonid length and the range in which they covered during the study. I used a Spearman rank correlation, which is basically just kind of a non-parametric regression, which allows you to look at the correlation between two variables, and it returned a significant value saying that larger fish typically had a larger range. While you would expect that in a natural system, the predictive value is like really terrible, so I wouldn't exactly use this for much, but it is interesting to note. Also, because I know one of you is going to ask me in a little bit, I went through and I removed all these outliers at one point, and it still returned a significant value. So there's still a great relationship between larger fish having a larger range. This graph is a range of movement of individuals during my study. So the furthest point upstream and the furthest point downstream I ever observed them during my study. And what you can see is 3 individuals moved really great distances, and then on average, fish moved about 90 meters. So I know not all of you are fish people, but this is some pretty big movements actually for a resident fish population. It depends. Movement seems to vary between systems and species, but a lot of studies have reported that many resident fish really don't move that much. They kind of find one place that meets all their needs and they just kind of hang out there. So I was surprised that they had this large of an average range, especially because I anticipated some of those buried sections of stream potentially to kind of limit some of their movement, at least seasonally. So this graph is kind of interesting to look at after looking at that range graph. This is looking at the first place I ever captured, tagged, and released a fish, and then the last place I ever observed that same fish, typically in October or January. And what you can see is that 60% of my fish ended up being found within 40 meters of the original capture location. So what that's telling me is that many of these fish might have a large range and move around a lot seasonally, especially during spawning season, for example, but many of them showed some site fidelity and kind of returned back to where I originally captured them, which was pretty interesting. Also, you can see fish were able to move both up and downstream, which is encouraging because I hope that fish in an urban system, if we're going to get them back in there, would be able to function and be able to access both up and downstream habitat. So I want to see how this would compare to what's been observed in a natural system. So luckily for me, there was a study put out in 2014 by Cano et al. On native resident brook trout population on a tributary to the Connecticut River. And there, I kind of tried to emulate their study a little bit so I could compare mine to what was in a natural system. So their study area was pretty similar to mine. They saw peak activity right around the same time of year that I observed. Their maximum observed distance was pretty similar, and also I mentioned that 40% or 60% of my fish were found within 40 meters on their first and last capture location. They documented about 62% of their fish in that same zone. So I know this is just 2 studies, and I can't draw too many conclusions from it or anything, but it is encouraging to see that fish in an urban, degraded system are moving somewhat in a natural manner. So I was also interested in those buried sections of stream, so I went through and surveyed all of them. I looked at diameter, slope, and length. Once again, these are kind of the 3 things that determine whether the velocity going through these culverts of water might inhibit the movement of salmonids in the upstream direction. So you can see that I was not able to get diameter or slope on culprit number 1. That's because this is that really long buried section and we don't exactly know what's going on there. I think it's a bunch of broken, disconnected culverts that are in there. And also I couldn't even see from one end to the other because there's like 4 buildings in the way. So I couldn't get that information. And then for culvert number 5, for some reason they installed it with like a 90-degree elbow in the middle of it, so I couldn't get an estimate of slope on that either. However, what I did see is the ones that I could collect data on, none of them had really extreme slopes, and none of them were too long, none of them had really small diameters, so I didn't anticipate any of them being full-time movement barriers for these fish. But I did think that just having these buried sections of stream might kind of deter some of the movement of these salmonids. However, what I saw was really encouraging. Buried sections 2 through 5, which, like I said previously, are more typical of what you see on urban systems in our area that are really low gradient. Fish were able to move both up and downstream through them. I saw young year adults and juveniles moving up and downstream during all different flow regimes during my studies, so that was really encouraging. Especially most of their movement was actually in the upstream direction, which was kind of surprising. However, buried section 1, kind of like I guessed it would be, does appear to be a movement barrier. 3 individuals moved downstream, but I never saw anybody move upstream. And so that indicates to me that likely they're having issues moving upstream through there. So that's going to be a big issue going forward to recovering anatomy salmonids, specifically to Wilson Creek. And to see how that's kind of might be impacting this resident population, I returned back to this range of movement graphs. So when I first looked at this, I was wondering why the heck there isn't anything in there from 300 to 550 meters. And so I believe a lot of it is related to that 300-meter buried section of stream. So you can see in this map here, this is my buried section 1, which is the movement barrier, and this is my restored area down here. I actually tagged almost half of my salmonids down here, and so they seem to be having a lot of trouble getting up there. So the maximum range any of these fish could even have during my study was 120 meters. So that really inhibited them from having those larger upstream ranges. And I think that is part of the reason that there's not any fish moving within this range in here. So in addition to this 300-meter buried section of stream, further downstream there's actually an 800-meter buried section of stream that wasn't in my study area. And it goes all the way underneath downtown's Ellensburg, and it goes underneath a lot of people's homes, it goes underneath buildings, underneath roadways, and then pops up behind the Palace Cafe. And so I'm pretty sure that that's probably a fish barrier the majority of the time. So the fact that Wilson Creek has not only one large buried section, but 2 large buried sections, means that it would be really expensive and really difficult to get anadromous salmonids back to this specific system. However, I did receive some interesting and maybe encouraging news. In November, I was downloading my pit tag antennas like I do every month, and I found a pit tag that wasn't one of mine. I was curious whose it was, so I looked. There's this massive website that has all the pit tag codes on there that everyone uploads when they tag fish all over the Columbia Basin. I couldn't find it on there, so I thought maybe it might be a cat or something, because sometimes I get their pit tags on my readers. But then I talked to WDFW, and they told me it was a fish that they just hadn't put on the website yet. And so they tagged it in the Tianaway River in August of 2016. So how did that fish get all the way to my study site? Someone might argue with me that maybe a bird ate it in the Tianaway and then flew all the way to Wilson Creek and flew underneath my antenna, or sat on my antenna, or pooped and the tag went through the antenna. But I think the most likely scenario is that this fish probably swam there. And if it did so, that's really encouraging, because this is the most urbanized system in all of Kittitas County. In fact, they would have had to swim down the Tianaway, down the Yakima River, and then 14 kilometers up Wilson Creek through a lot of urbanized stuff, and successfully navigate that 800-meter buried section of stream. And if that is the case, then I believe this would be the first anadromous salmonid that we have ever seen successfully navigate that 800-meter buried section of stream. So pretty interesting. So to kind of summarize what I did, habitat restoration, really small sample size, there's only one restored area. But it appears that habitat restoration seems to work. There was high density of salmonids and also high diversity of the native fish community in the restored area compared to the more urbanized systems. Also, it appears that urban streams can support salmonids. So there was a native species there, Oncorhynchus mykiss, that was really encouraging. Also, the brook trout that were there were able to move pretty well. They were able to spawn, successfully reproduce, and their young year were present and growing at a really rapid rate. So that's pretty encouraging. So going forward, I think it's really important to maybe go through and identify some of those obvious movement barriers on these urban systems, and replace some of them when we can. And as I mentioned, I think for Wilson Creek, my results kind of show that it's going to be really difficult to get fish back specifically to Wilson Creek because of those buried sections. However, overall, I think my data is really encouraging for the rest of this area. So this is the Wilson, Nanum, and Cherry Creek watershed. And what you can see is that my study site's just one little system, and there's all these other streams here. They're all very similar to Wilson Creek. They're all low gradient. They're all urbanized to some extent. However, none of these other ones have those large buried sections that we observe on Wilson Creek. So I believe that it would be a lot easier to go through and prioritize the removal of some of those smaller, obvious fish barriers on the lower reaches of some of these other urban systems, and potentially get salmonids back in some of these streams sooner than we originally anticipated. That would provide them access not only to this more degraded urban habitat here, but in the headwaters is some really high quality habitat that I believe steelhead in particular would really benefit from. So instead of just finishing there, I know you guys are going to ask me, why should I care about restoring urban streams? Because every time I tell anybody what I've been up to, they're like, oh, that's really cool, you've been monitoring fish, but who cares? And they're like, you're really biased about salmonids. And I say, I am. I would love to see, coho and steelhead spawning right here on campus. I think that'd be so cool to park there, go get a coffee at the Cirque, and watch a coho spawn right here. It'd be not only really cool for the fish, but also it'd be really awesome as an educational opportunity for students. And so, but I also am a realist, and I understand that not everyone cares about salmon, and many people don't want to invest, resources, time, and money into these things. However, I think there's a good reason that they should. And one of the main reasons, I'm sure many of you, saw some of the stuff going on over the last few weeks. And one of the big issues around here in the spring is flooding that we have going on. So the next few images are just, some flooding images from my study site. So, and a lot of this flooding is caused by poorly designed or installed infrastructure that's failing. There's a culvert somewhere down there that's making this weird suction of death spiral. And so that's why the water's all backed up, because this culvert is really small. If they would have installed larger culverts, then water would have been able to flow through these, and it wouldn't back up like this. You can see this culvert here. This is the Wellness Center. This is the one I mentioned that has a 90-degree elbow in the middle of it for some reason. And so it doesn't want to do a 90 degrees, so it just skips over the bank and is trying to go through the parking lot. It's also eroding around this culvert here, so this culvert's failing. There's actually a sinkhole back there, so that's why they put chain link fence around it. So they're going to need to replace this culvert sometime soon. So hopefully they'll do it with a bigger culvert. But these flooding events cause a lot of issues for many different people and many different stakeholders. It's not only dangerous for drivers, but also, agricultural operations lose crops, they lose soil when this kind of stuff's going on. These streams run through people's backyards, flood their houses every year. I mean, on Wilson Creek, some houses actually have it going underneath their house, which doesn't make any sense to me. And then also, that's just a really big issue for members of the public like yourselves. So I believe that there's a good reason to go through and fix some of these things. And luckily there's been something going on right now, and over the last few years, the Nanum, Wilson, Cherry Creek watershed assessment. And they've been going around and they've been trying to kind of look at some of those different issues that a lot of different stakeholders in this area might be concerned about when it comes to urban streams. So they've been trying to identify places where infrastructure improvements need to be made, issues where there's really large flood hazards, and also places where they could improve irrigation practices so we could keep more water in the streams during the summer months, and also have more sustainable operations going forward to continue our agriculture operations into the future. And then the other thing they're interested in is prioritizing salmon recovery actions. So I think the conditions are kind of right for recovering maybe salmonids to some of these systems as we go through and make some of these other improvements for the public. With that, I'd like to thank my committee, Dr. James, Dr. Beck, and Dr. Rango. Also, the CW Biology Department. All of them have been incredibly helpful and supportive over the last few years. The School of Graduate Studies provided me some funding through a grant. WDFW and Yakima Nation were really helpful. Gabe Temple and Ryan Steele especially answered a lot of my questions and provided me with some equipment that I needed. Zach Mays with Yakima Nation helped me construct my pit sag antennas, and if I wouldn't have had those, my data would have been really bad. So, and then also my fellow graduate students for helping me during my study, collect data, take pictures, and supporting me. And then my fiance Ashton for putting up with me over the last few years and encouraging me to go back to grad school, which I never thought I would do. So with that, if you have any questions.
I got a question for you. So How far from your site is it until it empties into the river?
About 14 kilometers.
14 kilometers, you say?
Yeah.
And then if we were to get it, there was a big chunk of money that was going to go towards opening up the buried sections, and you couldn't do it all, how much would you need to open up of those buried sections? I know that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
But like, what is shooting from the hip, what would you say?
Yeah, it's probably impossible question. See if I can get back to
Yeah.
this one image here. Sorry, I had a lot of slides. This one. Okay, so yeah, it would be really expensive. If I had in a perfect world, I'd just daylight all of it. Paul has a really cool idea of like putting Wilson Creek down Pearl Street or something like that, so we could all eat and drink and watch salmon spawn downtown, which would be really cool, and I think they should definitely do that. But I doubt that'll happen in Kid Test Time. But as you can see, all these urban streams, this area is really, really strange. A lot of it's been altered to kind of deliver water to people's properties and things like that. And also there's just this big alluvial fan here. So these systems come down, hit that fan, and they spread out everywhere. But then the way, I don't know if all of it's natural or if a lot of it's engineered, they all return back into one spot. So this, you can consider this all Wilson Creek, really. So some of these other ones that aren't as urbanized, I think we could expend like less money on some of these things and maybe find the route that would be least expensive to get them back into these watersheds. And then what they found from Paul's study is that fish could make their way out through some of these urban streams. So if we could just get fish spawning in this upper habitat, they could still reach almost all of these streams in some capacity. So that would kind of enable them to rear in some of these other areas. So I don't know how much it would cost. But if we could find a really good route to get them somewhere, it could help. Emil?
Well, so I guess to piggyback on that, if you're saying that they would exit down, like I said, Wilson Creek as it is, but then when, come spawning time, they're trying to get back into their headwaters, don't they follow, whatever kind of chemical or whatever?
So no, there's like tons of issues associated with
Yeah.
it. So, and that's kind of the stuff that Wilson Creek Nano and Cherry, I think they're supposed to have a report out here sometime soon. An updated one, but they're trying to, maybe identify the best path for getting those fish up there the soonest. But yeah, they'd have to screen things, which would be really difficult. Also, there's a lot. I mean, I didn't get into all this because I obviously can't do it all. But there's a lot of issues facing the recovery of these fish in there. There's also all these irrigation ditches you can see running, the wrong way through here. Those aren't really screened either, so fish could potentially just get lost in those as well. So there's a lot of stuff, that would need to be fixed to get the fish back in there.
I'm wondering, how much influence does these stream barriers have on the fish, on their tendency to either be resident or anadromous?
I think the ones that are in this system, I think a lot of those Oncorhynchus mykiss that were in my study area, I would expect most of those to be resident fish just because of the size they were. But I think it really does impact them because I think it kind of selects for those resident life histories. Because as I mentioned, Oncorhynchus mykiss, for example, sometimes even two rainbow trout species will spawn together, so resident species will spawn together, and one of their offspring will randomly decide to be anadromous. But for the most part, when resident fish species breed together, typically they have resident offspring. So in these areas, if they spawn, like say, when they first put in these culverts, and a steelhead spawned up here, all of its juveniles, for the most part, would leave. And so it would just kind of be selecting for these resident species because the ones that are anadromous make these massive migrations out of the ocean, and then they can't get back to their spawning areas if there's barriers. So I think it just artificially selects for resident fish.
They identify, I was
I
just gonna say, they identify like any genes that are involved in these life history differences?
Not for, like Pacific salmon, all of them they're all anadromous unless you put them in, the Great Lakes, and then they can't get to the ocean. So they use the lakes as an ocean. So Pacific salmon species, all of those are definitely anadromous, but steelhead, they're just kind of a funky one that can do different things. And no, they haven't identified a gene for it. That's cool.
The 6% of the coho that made it down the Columbia River, on hatchery fish, is that something that's average, or are those numbers going to be higher?
I think they would be higher. Yeah.
Okay.
I think they'd be higher. Because the Wilson Creek stretch in particular, you guys lost a lot of fish compared to...
Yeah, Mercer had a higher rate
Yeah.
that made it to the Columbia.
Yeah, so it's not ideal. And some of that could also be because those brook trout are in there. Mercer Creek has fewer brook trout in it. So the brook trout could have maybe been directly preying on some of the coho, or just limiting some of the habitat that they might actually want to use and pushing them into inferior habitat. So.
And then what's the possibility of diverting Wilson Creek around town?
Yeah, I have no idea what that would be. I don't know, we've talked about this before, like we talked about Whiskey Creek or something, maybe being the best route, and maybe they could,
Consider doing that.
yeah, send it a different route.
Because it doesn't go through town.
Yeah, and then maybe they'd have more room to open up, some other habitat and fix it. Instead of, I don't know how you're gonna bury it from downtown.
Yeah, so if you're gonna restore Wilson Creek, I mean, you basically are making the habitat great for brook trout maybe, right? So
Yeah.
could you address that potential issue?
Yeah, so there's ways to eradicate brook trout. Some of them don't work very well. So they do some things and they go through and use that electrofisher. Yeah, or they can just fish for them. We can put a bounty on them and have a derby every year. So you could go through and electrofish and kind of eradicate them, especially during spawning season to get them out. But then we were just at this AFS conference and there's this cool new crazy thing that they're just starting to pilot this year. And it's like YY brook trout. And so they breed them to have Y chromosomes only. And then they introduce them to these systems. So when they reproduce, they only produce males. And so they do that in conjunction with going through and removing these fish with electrofishing, and eventually you can get it to where there's just males in there and the population crashes. And I think they can do it in like 5 years in a single system or something, which is kind of crazy. So, but don't ask me about that because I just saw talk about that. So, what's up, Chris?
I was interested in your number of species that you showed, a table, I think, and you said that you had the most number of species in that large open section that's been restored. So I had a couple questions about that. One is, I think the number of species was for that whole length. So, the more you sample, the more species you get up to a certain point. I didn't know that.
Well, that's all that's, sorry, I'll get there. There it is. There it is.
Yeah. Okay, so do you think you've got more species in that section, possibly, at least partly due to the fact that it's a big section? Or did you have all of those species in each 10 meters of that
They were
restored
pretty.
section?
They were pretty well distributed throughout it. I mean, some of those species like different habitat. A lot of them like pool habitat, and that's why I think a lot of them are in that restored area because the other areas are really lacking in pool habitat.
Yeah.
But they were pretty evenly distributed throughout that whole restored area. So I don't know if the length would affect it so much, but that's.
And I know you're interested more in the Salmonids, but I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
You got all those species. So where did they come from?
So
Because,
that's another thing.
right,
Yeah.
They probably weren't there before when the habitat was really bad.
Yeah, and so that's another thing that if I had endless money and time, I would be interested in looking at. Because if that movement barrier is right here between these two open sections of stream, that could prevent all these fish from maybe making it upstream. So they might be able to move upstream and then not go any further. So maybe they would be in this lower quality habitat. So that's another kind of issue that I didn't bring up. But because that's another thing that has been demonstrated with movement barriers. When they've done a lot of the urban stream work, they've mainly just looked at the densities above and below structures, and typically there's higher, diversity. There's higher diversity of the fish community below barriers than there's above it, because it just kind of selects for the stronger swimming ones upstream. So I don't know if some of these could be coming from upstream and making their way down and then just deciding they like that habitat better and hanging out in the restored area, or if they're just coming from lower downstream. So it's a good question. I wish I should.
So I know you did like drift nets for inverts for a little while. And I'm wondering for your big long underground section,
Yeah.
I would expect there to be not like much food in there for fish.
Yeah.
So like anecdotally, did you see like maybe less inverts coming out of that big long buried section compared to some of the open ones?
Kyle Hatch, who was here before as an undergrad, he did a thing where he looked at that and he did see that there was a significant relationship, but he was doing it at night, and I kind of had this idea that as time goes on during night, like the drift of insects increases, and so I don't know if, I don't want to even knock Kyle, but because I want to do it for my study, I thought maybe it already would be significant just because they're already changing the rate at which they're actually drifting downstream. If he sampled downstream first and then went upstream, because that's what he did every time. But when I took samples during the day, there was a ton of it. There was a ton of drift. Like that one sample I told you took me like 24 hours just to sort through it and just get it down to like order. Yeah, that was a 15-minute sample, and it was right below that culvert. So there's just like a ridiculous amount of invertebrates in there. So that's another reason why these fish are growing so fast.
Did you find any Chinook in there at all? Juveniles? Any around?
I wish.
And I have another question. What else do you think is a limiting factor for like the buried pipe underground to be a fish barrier? Is it just like a whole bunch of reasons, do you think, or did you test anything else? Like,
I mean, with that really big section, I can't see what's going on there. There is a grate in one spot, and I can see that there's two cords that one's kind of perched above the other one, so I think that could be one right there. But I wouldn't be
physically, like a
yeah, physical barrier, but I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere else underneath that, because I mean, Paul showed me the map. The first documentation we have of this is in like 1897 or something like that, where it says Wilson Creek buried. So I'm just assuming they didn't probably do a really good job.
do you think they'd swim through it just if it's dark all the time? They wouldn't have to go on the day.
I don't know. I've heard that that steelhead typically don't like to go into dark places, but if that one made it to my study area, then I guess it could be possible.
So why didn't you do a snorkeling survey?
We talked about it. Yeah, Paul said that someone tried to go in there one time, and there was like a weird drop off, and he got a little sketched out and just decided.
Yeah, right under Walnut Street, some guy said he crawled through there towards Venman's with a headlamp, and then it just fell into a pool.
Which that would definitely.
And I don't know why he got scared, but then he came out. But,
So if the problem is all these cliffs and pools and chasms,
Yeah.
could we just fix that and the barrier wouldn't be such an issue? Or is it the darkness itself?
I'm sure the darkness would probably deter some of their movement. And on top of that, if you just fix that barrier and just made a culvert 800 meters, that fish would like almost continuously have to be swimming unless you install little like places where they could take refuge. So that's a lot of energy that they need to put in to get up there. So that probably would just kind of convince them to go back. Yeah. If you're gonna spend time to fix each, just do it right.
I have a question about water temperatures.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm a terrestrial ecologist,
Yes.
and temperatures vary a lot
Mhm.
on a daily basis, and they probably don't in the streams,
Yeah.
but I'm just wondering, since you did average daily temperature, in some of these shallower streams, could that maximum daily temperature have ever gone above those thresholds? that
Yeah, and
you've shown?
it did only 2 times though. Did it ever reach where the brook trout were, and it never reached where those mykiss were. And actually, there was like a decent range in there, but I was originally hoping I could put the average and the maximum minimum, but they were like way too close together. So actually, I think that water just kind of buffers against some of that temperature. But overall, I was surprised how low the water temperature was in the study area, and there wasn't really any differences between my upstream reaches and the lower one, because I was kind of hoping maybe that buried section might make it cooler or something, but it didn't.
others, you guys want to go get some sunshine? Is that?
So. Take some cookies. I don't want to eat that.
Well, thanks.